Good morning. The Subcommittee on Environment and Climate Change will now come to order. Today, the Subcommittee is holding a hearing entitled the Fiscal Year 2022 EPA Budget. Due to the COVID-19 public health emergency, today's hearing is being held remotely. All members and witnesses will be participating via video conferencing. As part of our hearing, microphones will be set on mute for purposes of eliminating inadvertent background noise. Members and witnesses, you will need to unmute your microphone each time you wish to speak. Documents for the record can be sent to Rebecca Tomelchek at the email address we've provided to staff. All documents will be entered into the record at the conclusion of the hearing. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. Today we have the pleasure of welcoming the recently confirmed 16th Administrator of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, Michael S. Regan. And we welcome him to the Energy and Commerce Committee's hearing here and the subcommittee hearing. And Mr. Administrator, congratulations on your confirmation and welcome to the Subcommittee on Environment and Climate Change. Excuse me. We look forward to your testimony and discussion of our President's Fiscal Year 2022 budget request and other EPA priorities. While you have only recently joined the agency, I know you are fully aware of the critical role that EPA must play in leading our nation's response to some of the biggest public health, environmental, and economic challenges we now face. None of these challenges will be easy, but I am hopeful that we are entering a new era at EPA, and this reset could not come at a more urgent moment for America or the world. The President's Fiscal Year 2022 discretionary funding requests a $11.2 billion for the agency, a $2 billion increase from last year's enacted levels. The President's request highlights several priorities, including $1.8 billion for programs to tackle the climate crisis in ways that also promote and restore environmental justice, $3.6 billion for our nation's long-neglected water systems, many of which are contaminated with PFAS, lead, and other dangerous substances, robust funding for Superfund and Brownfield remediation projects, and increased air quality monitoring and enforcement in overburdened communities. As we work to recover from the COVID public health crisis, we must not take our eye off the many environmental threats facing countless American communities. EPA must act boldly to advance robust policies on climate change, on clean water, chemical safety, and on land remediation. This agenda will certainly require increased staffing to meet the nation's needs, a challenge compounded by the loss of nearly 1,000 EPA employees over the past 4 years. Today, the agency's workforce is at its lowest level since 1988, even as we are expecting EPA to play such a critical role in addressing numerous complicated public health and environmental challenges. There is a clear need to rebuild the agency's staff capacity and to attract new, talented people to public service, both to get the job done today and to allow for an effective transfer of institutional knowledge to a new generation of public servants from the current long-term EPA workers who are nearing retirement. I was happy to see funding in the budget for this purpose. A fully staffed EPA workforce is essential to protecting human health and the environment, enforcing our environmental laws, and indeed tackling climate change. I have also been impressed to see the Biden administration's recommitment to strong scientific integrity principles. Our public health and environmental protections must be grounded in robust science, ensuring that EPA career staffers can conduct their work and develop rules based on sound science, free from interference from political and special interests, is a cornerstone for good, trustworthy governance at the agency. This should be the case regardless of which party sits in the White House. And I look forward to working with the administration to strengthen and codify all agencies' scientific integrity policies. Finally, in addition to this EPA budget request, President Biden has proposed the American Jobs Plan. This subcommittee has the opportunity and the responsibility to take and make tremendous contributions to the American Jobs Plan or any other infrastructure package being considered in Congress. The AJP includes funding for the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund, full lead service line replacements, remediation of brownfields and Superfund sites, and reduction of diesel emissions from the DERA, and deployment of zero-emission school buses. These programs have enjoyed strong bipartisan support in the past, and significant investments in these areas will indeed benefit people and communities in every district across our country. I'm looking forward to pursuing this agenda to protect public health and the environment while modernizing our nation's infrastructure and jumpstarting our post-COVID economic recovery. Again, Mr. Regan, I thank you again for joining us. Congratulations again on the appointment, and I look forward to today's discussion. I will now recognize Mr. McKinley, Representative McKinley, serving as the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Environment and Climate Change. And Representative McKinley, you're recognized for 5 minutes, please, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Tonko, and welcome Administrator Regan. I particularly appreciate our conversation yesterday. Look, I think one thing we can all agree to is the world needs to reduce its carbon emissions, and I think we're on the same page here. But the president has repeatedly pledged publicly to decarbonize the power sector by 2035, and some in Congress are trying to upgrade, move that up till 2030. But I want, in this hearing today with him and over his budget, is to look at what will have to happen for a power plant to meet that goal. First, we have to have carbon capture technology must become commercially viable. Secondly, we have to have a new source review program must be reviewed. And thirdly, the United States needs to develop a pipeline system to dispose of this captured carbon. Utility companies have found that it takes 7 to 8 years to get a new source review permit and do all the engineering, design, and permitting to install carbon capture to achieve net zero. So if utilities must comply with the Democrats' goal of 2030, they're going to have to start immediately using today's technology. But it's widely recognized that today's carbon capture technology is not ready for prime time. It's incapable of capturing 80% of our fossil fuel or our carbon emissions. So, but let's just assume that the technology works in the next 12 months. And we can indeed capture 80% of the carbon emitted. Utilities will next need to have a new source review permit approved to upgrade their facilities. Yet the new source review program lacks certainty and predictability. Just think about, when was the last time any of us in Congress heard of a utility getting a new source review permit to make a major modification? They're not. It's not a reliable process. According to GAO, their EPA recently reviewed 831 NSR units that have been approved by the NSR. 467 of them were found to be in violation. And the utility had to go back and redo everything that they had just gotten permission to accomplish. That's not certainty, that's insanity. And it can cost hundreds of millions of dollars to utilities and the consumers as a result of the EPA not following its regulations. So what our utilities need is certainty. That's why the new source review needs to be reformed. If there's nothing in the president's agenda or in this budget that I can see discussing reforms to this program. Rather, it seems the administration is following the same philosophical agenda as President Biden's, which is focusing on regulations. What a novel thing, Chairman, if we focus instead on innovating first, finding a lit in our laboratories, our scientists and our researchers to come up with the way of carbon capture rather than punishing them. So we could be showing American leadership. Now, let's assume that they can get the carbon technology and they're actually to get a permit for it. So now the power plant needs to develop a pipeline system to transport the captured carbon. That Democrats don't have, that they have unfortunately an adverse position towards pipelines. So just look at what's happened over the Keystone Pipeline, the Dakota Access Pipeline, the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, the Mountain Valley Pipeline, the Line 5 in Michigan. All of these are showing problems. So why do we think, as we develop this, that the environmentalists are going to let states and the administration approve more pipelines? I don't think they're going to be built, and those pipelines, if they get held up in court, won't be built by 2030. We will have accomplished nothing. So all these things need to come together. We have to develop carbon capture. We have to have reforms to new source review, and we have to build out a system of carbon dioxide pipelines to get the project away. But in the quiet of the night, the EPA and the administration know this can't be achieved. You know that, and the rest of the people on this panel. So why isn't the administration just simply being honest with the American public? This is nothing but a politically driven agenda aimed at ending jobs and the use of coal and natural gas in this country. Coal miners and gas workers all across America will suffer, losing their homes, jobs, and livelihoods, and they'll fall into poverty. I say again, where is the justice in that process? So I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Chairman yields back, and the chair now recognizes the chair of the full committee, Representative Chairman Pallone. You recognize, Chairman, for 5 minutes for your opening statement, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Chairman Tonko, and it really is a pleasure to welcome the EPA Administrator, Michael Regan, to this committee for his first appearance, and I hope there'll be many more. I want to thank the Administrator and the leadership of President Biden that now we can actually look at this year's EPA budget with optimism about what can be achieved. The EPA is back to work protecting the planet and public health, and in my opinion, not a moment too soon. The country is facing multiple overlapping crises, and the EPA will play a critical role in solving them. We must collectively address the climate crisis, the COVID-19 pandemic, racial inequality, and the severe economic damage resulting from the pandemic. And these challenges are substantial, but fortunately, the Biden administration has hit the ground running really on day one. President Biden's American Rescue Plan is already making a difference by crushing the virus and providing critical relief to struggling Americans. His American Jobs Plan, which he aligns with this committee's Lift America Act, will help us build back better so we can create millions of new jobs, combat the climate crisis by setting the course for a clean future, and ensure no community is left behind. And that was certainly an important part of his speech last night. I thought it was a great speech. And then last week, the president submitted in this Global Earth Day, 2 days, a strong national commitment for the Paris Agreement that aligns with the national goal, including that's included in our Clean Future Act. As you know, the Clean Future Act Administrator was introduced by myself, Chairs Tonko and Rush, and many of my colleagues on the committee. And like the president, we believe the goal of reducing emission by at least 50% by 2030 is necessary and achievable. This year's EPA budget and the American Jobs Plan will help us get there. And I also saw, I thought I saw Kathy Castor as well, who has been working with us on the Clean Future Act. The budget includes $1.8 billion for EPA programs to fight climate change through funding for research, grants to state programs, and supportive agency activities. The investments in the American Jobs Plan go even further with $100 billion for power infrastructure and significant investments in reducing emissions from schools, vehicles, and federal buildings. The budget also increases funding for Superfund and Brownfields cleanups. And again, the American Jobs Plan goes even further, calling for reinstatement of the Superfund tax and investing $5 billion in cleanups. And, I really want to stress, Administrator, the importance of bringing back the Superfund. We know that investing in Superfund cleanups creates jobs, mitigates threats to human health, and directly benefits the communities around contaminated sites, which are often low-income communities and communities of color. And both the budget and the American Jobs Plan call for big investments in drinking water infrastructure, including the replacement of lead pipes, which is critical to addressing public health threats. Again, the president stressed the lead pipes initiative last night. This funding will be critical to drinking water infrastructure systems serving disadvantaged communities in particular. I think we're at a crucial time for environmental protection. The impacts of climate change are already here, affecting communities across the nation and the world. PFAS and other emerging contaminants are showing up in our drinking water, air, and soil. I saw Congresswoman Dingell. She's been a leader on PFAS. And our water infrastructure is crumbling, and too many communities are struggling with lead contamination. Unfortunately, over the course of the last administration, We saw decades of work by EPA's dedicated career staff disregarded or overturned in critical areas of environmental and public health protection. We saw science marginalized under the Trump administration. We saw special interests favored over the public interest, and we saw secrecy at the highest level. Administrator Regan, it falls to you to right this ship and restore the EPA to the highest standards of scientific integrity. We often say that a budget demonstrates the values and the priorities of the administration proposing it, and it's a relief. Equity and environmental stewardship, and the American Jobs Plan and our new national commitment under the Paris Agreement make these priorities even clearer. So I just wanted to say at last year's budget hearing, during the last year of the Trump administration, I said there was a better path forward to combating climate change and protecting public health. And I'm happy to say that we're now on that path. We in Congress and on this committee are ready to work with you to restore EPA, protect the public health and climate change. And let me also say a word about our chairman as I yield back. I know, Paul, you've been out front on all these things, and I thank you so much. This is a very important hearing. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. The gentleman yields back, and Chair now recognizes Mrs. Rogers, ranking member of the full committee, for 5 minutes for her opening statement. Representative Rogers, please.
Thank you. Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Administrator Regan. Just let me first congratulate and personally welcome you to the Energy and Commerce Committee. Our committee has legislative responsibilities for and regulatory oversight over the vast majority of your statutory authority. And we look forward to working with you. We take our responsibilities very seriously. You know, I think we can be proud that America has led the world in innovation and technology, lifting people out of poverty, raising the standard of living more than any other country in the world, while also leading the world in reducing global carbon emissions more than the next 12 countries combined. We hope that you are committed to implementing the law as written by the elected representatives of the people and not creating your own rule book. And based upon the kind words that I've heard from your home state colleagues, as well as your reputation, I do expect that today will be a thoughtful, ongoing dialogue that we begin with you. We're eager to learn more about the Biden-Harris administration's proposed EPA budget. It does represent a 21.4% increase over EPA's current funding levels. And if Congress gives EPA all of the proposed budget, it will be the most money ever appropriated to EPA by over $1 billion. And there's really not a lot of details yet, less than 2 pages with very limited information. Money is one view of an administration's vision for EPA, but I also think it's important, as those of us who exercise the power of the purse under Article 1, that we know what we're buying and that we don't just base success upon how big that check is. I want to reflect just for a moment on the time before the pandemic, just over a year ago, when our economy was booming. We had the hottest job market in half a century, after a decade of people asking, where are the jobs? Wages were rising. More jobs were available than people looking for work. And it was because we had lifted the regulatory burden, reversing the top-down decisions that often comes through federal agencies and decisions that had been made at EPA that was hurting our economy, hurting our farmers, hurting our ranchers. So when it comes to EPA's budget and the agency's reflection of priorities, we want to understand if innovation, the private sector foundation of jobs and the engine of so much success in our country, is being sidelined. Regulations and political forces should not be molding the economy and making EPA the arbiter of all acceptable economic growth. We want to work with you to grow the American economy and clean up the environment where it's unsafe. But we also want to understand if this budget will hold back the potential for our economy to boom again in the long term, especially for our fossil fuel communities. We want to know that science, reliable, high quality, objective science, is being used to inform decision making. That EPA won't hide from public scrutiny of this science, and that EPA will not intentionally mischaracterize science to politicize actual policy judgments. We want to know if this budget will encourage cooperative federalism as a viable partnership between the federal government and your former colleagues in the states, or if the states are merely seen as underfunded servants of federal centralized planning. We want to know whether this budget envisions EPA following the law or infusing its own intent into it, whether EPA is focusing its resources on improving environmental and public health outcomes through compliance, or if the agency will use its enforcement policy to punish violators and harass politically disfavored entities. We want to know if this budget will build on the undisputed environmental successes of the last administration, the most Superfund cleanups in 2 decades, reduced air pollution with economic growth, and increased inspection and permitting efficiencies. Or does this budget end these results for partisan reasons, dropping agency accountability and responsibility to Americans and the law? We want to know if grave lessons have been learned from past EPA politicians who focus their attention on a few major priorities, allowing the mundane areas to explode in the horrors in Flint and East Chicago. Finally, we listen to and care about the practicalities, including affordability of its actions on futures of people in rural areas and struggling businesses. Mr. Administrator, these are serious questions. We want to work with you for positive gains for our communities we represent and allow the private sector expansion and environmental protection. We may not always agree, but we certainly want to focus on these shared goals, and I welcome you being with us. Look forward to your testimony. Thank you very much.
The chair would like to remind members that pursuant to committee rules, all members' written opening statements shall be made part of the record. I now will introduce the witness for today's hearing. Again, we welcome the Honorable Michael S. Regan, Administrator of the United States Environmental Protection Agency. He, before this, served as Secretary of North Carolina's Department of Environmental Quality. The distinction here for Administrator Regan is that he becomes the first African-American male to lead the great agency and is the first to graduate from an historic Black college. He has his bachelor's degree from North Carolina A&T and a master's degree in public policy from George Washington University. He has also worked at the Environmental Defense Fund and at EPA. And with that, we welcome him and wish him well in his new role. And it is very kind of you, sir, to share your thoughts and your time with us today. And so we'll recognize you for 5 minutes, please, for an opening statement.
Well, thank you, Chairman Tonko, Ranking Member McKinley, the Chair and Ranking Member of the full committee, and members of the subcommittee. I'm grateful for the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss the U.S. EPA's discretionary funding request for fiscal year 2022. For half a century, EPA has helped provide the American people with clean air to breathe, clean water to drink, and safe and healthy land. Earlier this month, as it has been mentioned, President Biden sent Congress a discretionary funding request for EPA at $11.2 billion. We believe this request will help ensure EPA can continue to meet its essential mandate, set the stage for our nation's economic recovery, and provide the resources necessary to confront our environmental challenges, especially in our most overburdened communities. The President has seized this moment to reimagine a new American economy that leads the world in advancing clean energy, modernizes our infrastructure while enabling it to withstand impacts from climate change, and right the historic wrongs of past environmental justice that have held back generations of Black, Latinx, Indigenous, and low-income communities. This funding request reflects the understanding that a healthy environment and a healthy economy are not mutually exclusive. They actually go hand in hand. These investments will provide tremendous opportunity to leverage American innovation, put people back to work, protect our communities, families, and children from environmental hazard and harm. In short, the request recognizes the profound urgency and existential threat of the climate crisis and provides EPA with the resources essential to fulfill our mission to protect human health, the environment, and the economy. Ensuring access to clean and safe water for all Americans impacts our nation's climate resilience and is integral to advancing environmental justice. At EPA, we have seen that investing in water infrastructure is a win-win for public health and economic development. EPA's Water Infrastructure Finance and Innovation Act loan has helped finance $19.4 billion in water infrastructure and helped to create 47,000 jobs nationwide. The FY22 funding request of $3.6 billion for EPA rebuilds our water infrastructure. It's an increase of more than $600 million over FY 2021 because the resources are needed. This includes targeted increases to the state revolving loan funds to assist states, tribes, and territories with infrastructure projects that help provide safe drinking water and clean water in communities all across the country. Water infrastructure investments, however, only represent one side of ensuring safe and clean water. The agency will invest resources and expand efforts to address the pervasive and persistent chemicals known as PFAS in our drinking water. As part of the President's commitment to tackle PFAS, the funding request provides approximately $75 million to accelerate toxicity studies and fund research to inform the regulatory developments of designing PFAS, designating PFAS as a hazardous substance, while setting enforceable limits for PFAS under the Safe Drinking Water Act. Under the President's leadership, we're heeding the call of the youth as well, who are courageously urging world leaders to fight the climate crisis with innovation, fortitude, and resolve. The budget invests in programs that will help reduce greenhouse gas emissions, including $100 million for air quality grants to states and tribes to tackle emissions on the state and local level. Much like climate change, environmental justice underpins all of our work as well. The pandemic ignited a perfect storm for communities of color and low-income communities who already bear the burden, the highest burdens of pollution, suffer higher rates of mortality from heart and lung disease, and now COVID-19 too. The budget invests $936 million towards new accelerating economic justice initiatives that will help create jobs, clean up pollution, and implement the Justice 40 initiative to advance racial equality. America's most contaminated land reduce emissions of toxic substances and greenhouse gases from existing and abandoned infrastructure also relies on improvements to CERCLA. So, Chairman, what I'd like to say, and members of the subcommittee, the fiscal year 2022 budget will help ensure EPA can meet the interconnected health and environmental crisis we face, lift up communities who have long been left behind, and put the nation on a prosperous economic path of recovery. This funding request lays down a marker that EPA is ready to meet these challenges. So thank you for the opportunity to testify today in a transparent and honest manner. And I look forward to continuing our partnership as well as welcome any questions that you might have. Thank you so much.
You're most welcome, and thank you for your appearance before the subcommittee today. We'll now move to member questions, and I'll start by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. So, Administrator Regan, we thank you for your testimony and for your desire to serve. Are you familiar with the agency's scientific integrity policy?
I am.
And will you ensure that the office responsible for administering this policy has the resources necessary to effectively address scientific integrity complaints when they arise?
Absolutely.
Thank you. I look forward to working with you to ensure EPA's technical career staff are able to conduct their work free from the interference of political and special interests. I think it's key to the functioning of the agency. Last week, President Biden announced our next nationally determined contribution, or the NDC, under the Paris Agreement. The United States is setting an economy-wide target of reducing its net greenhouse gas emissions by 50 to 52% below 2005 levels in 2030. President Biden has been clear that this target will necessitate a whole-of-government approach on climate action at the federal level. However, we know that EPA, as our nation's expert agency for air pollution, will be critical. So, Administrator, what do you see as the EPA's role in ensuring our country achieves that NDC that has been set out by President Biden?
Well, thank you for the question. And there's no doubt that the president has an aggressive posture to mitigate the climate crisis. And EPA plays a central role. We're not the only actor. Wisely so, the president has designated this a government-wide activity, but we do play an important role. And Congress has delegated certain statutory authorities to the agency to focus on air quality and water quality issues that are relevant to climate change. So we will be focusing on transportation sources, stationary sources, methane, and other categories that fall within our purview that are important to meet our climate goals.
And what could achieving this greenhouse gas emissions goal mean for reducing traditional air and water pollution?
There are significant benefits to both air quality, natural resources, and the health of our citizens. So we will see lots of improvement in traditional pollutants as well that really do hamper our ability to live the healthiest of lives. There are co-benefits for sure, not only on the health side, but there are lots of economic development and economic opportunities and job creation opportunities as well. So we see this as a significant opportunity.
Well, to meet this goal, obviously it's going to take a lot of focus. So what existing programs, authorities, and tools might EPA be looking to utilize, especially considering that we will need reductions from the power sector, transportation, and every other sector of the economy?
We're going to do this using the traditional statutory authority that we have, and we're going to go through very transparent rulemaking processes that will engage all of our stakeholders, the regulated community, environmental interest, our chambers of commerce, our private sector, and we will focus on looking at tailpipe emissions and the goals that we have set out there. The president has indicated or requested that the agency have a proposal due in July for vehicles that run up to the years 2026. We'll do that in a very transparent manner. We'll also look at methane reductions. We'll be looking at a proposal for that this upcoming September. And we'll be looking at replacing the Clean Power Plant. All of these will be done in a very transparent and open way. And I pledge that we will convene all of the stakeholders involved and take input and have robust discussions on these topics.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And given the urgency of the issue, it is critical we use those existing authorities to the fullest to complement the investments in the American Jobs Plan and the FY22 budget. Many members of Congress are interested in supporting the agency's efforts. How can Congress help, and what new resources or authorities are necessary to ensure this target is achieved?
Well, we are very well aware that, number one, we cannot regulate our way out of the situation we find ourselves in. And number two, we view Congress, we view the states, we view all of our stakeholders as significant partners as we navigate these waters. We're going to take a look at what we need, but we also want to provide technical expertise to Congress as you all contemplate new pieces of legislation that might provide complements to the regulatory and statutory authority that has been delegated to our agency.
Well, thank you, Mr. Administrator. I look forward to working with you on this year's budget and enactment of the American Jobs Plan so that we can improve public health and protect our environment while modernizing, a great agenda, modernizing the infrastructure desperately needed across our country. Again, I thank you. And I'll now recognize Representative McKinley, who is our subcommittee ranking member, as you know. He'll be recognized now for 5 minutes for questioning.
Thank you again, Mr. Chairman, and thank you again, Administrator Regan, not only for appearing before us, but also our conversation yesterday to get to know each other, because we're going to be working well, hopefully, together over the years. But I want to go back to one issue here, and that is it's a three-legged stool. We talked about that. That carbon capture, new source review, and having a piping system to be able to do this. Then we can achieve this net zero by some time, not politically driven by 2035, but we're moving in that direction. I think the chairman, Kathleen Morris Rogers, mentioned that too. So let's just focus on this for a minute. if by 2035, do you think DOE is already at meetings with them? DOE says they don't think we're going to have carbon capture technology developed to be zero by 2035. Do you think we'll have carbon capture technology by 2035?
Well, based on the conversations that I've had with the electric industry, power plant owners and the like, carbon capture isn't the only tool in the toolbox that they plan to look at and deploy. And so, number one, I think we want to continue to invest heavily in all of the efficiencies and technologies available to meet these goals. And I look forward to having a robust conversation with you, with the power plant sector and others to achieve these goals.
If I could reclaim my time, I hear that, but what about 2030? Because I know Chairman Pallone is earnestly moving in that direction to go to 2030. Is that possible that we could get it to 80% reduction by 2030?
You know, based on the conversations that we're having with DOE, with the private sector, with the industries, we believe we can make a strong run at and be successful at 2030.
Strong run isn't the answer. Is it 80%? That's what this legislation that we're going to deal with. I want to see in your budget, do you have enough money in there for research to be able to get us down to 80% by 2030?
I think when you look at our budget, the 2022 budget, and what we need to do to fulfill our obligations, yes, I believe that in concert with DOE, I believe in concert with EEI and the power sector, I believe in concert with the rural electric cooperatives, all of which we're having conversations with, that looking at combinations of technologies, we can reach that 80% goal.
Take my time back. You understand that has to happen in the next year, not 5, 6, 7 years from now. We have to start now because it takes 7 to 8 years to do this. That's why I laid the plan out. So I don't want to know can we do it now? So my question, what about the new source review program that we know it needs reform? Because otherwise utilities right now could be reducing their emissions, but it's such a complicated process that requires it. Are you willing to work with us to make these reforms? Are you willing to reform new source review?
I'm willing to take a look at any efficiencies that we can put in any of our regulations to achieve these goals. And I do want to comment that in order to reach the 80% goal, I don't want to speak for the utilities in terms of market decisions they're making, but all of the decisions made to meet 80% won't rely solely on technology. They have plans in place to retire some of these assets. And so this is why we have to
retiring is because of the regulatory uncertainty and the threats that are being posed to them. I understand that. We can have that more conversation, but what about the pipelines? Are you going to be able to work with us to assure that when our power plants put in the carbon capture and they want to build the pipelines, will you help us in streamlining and getting those permits? Can you guarantee us that if a utility, a fossil fuel plant builds carbon capture, that you will work with us to see that those pipelines are constructed?
That's exactly what this process is designed to do, to engage you, to
really
engage
yes or no,
utilities.
Mr. Administrator, if you could. Is it yes or no?
Yes, we will work with you, with the utilities and others who want to deploy.
I only have 30 seconds left, Administrator. So my question, I want to know, what role will the EPA undertake to keep fossil fuels, coal and natural gas and oil, to remain in the energy mix after 2035? Can you explain that role, how you're going to keep these jobs that are being threatened right now?
You know, what I'll say is our role is to work with the industry and take a look at where the market, where their investments are taking them, and look at how our technology standards complement the desire to reduce emissions while complement the investments that many of them are making, and leverage the technologies to do so. So I really do look forward to a robust conversation on how we have the science, the markets, the economics, and the technology marry in a way that gives America a competitive advantage.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back my balance of my time. Thank you.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes Chairman Pallone for 5 minutes for questioning, please.
Thank you, Chairman Tonko. Administrator Regan, I wanted to talk about Superfund and Brownfields. the EPA budget request calls for increases in funding for both programs, which I support, especially given the Superfund backlog. And, this is something that has been involved with New Jersey members and this committee for so long. I'm always giving out history lessons, but Jim Florio, who was my predecessor on the committee, sponsored the Superfund. Senator Lautenberg was a Senate sponsor, and the Brownfields program was the idea of Administrator Whitman, who was the governor of New Jersey, Republican, before she became administrator of the EPA, and Paul Gilmore, a Republican member, and myself were the ones that sponsored the original Brownfields federal program. So how will the requested increase for Superfund impact the backlog that exists? And would you commit to working with Congress to get these backlog cleanups started? That's my first question.
The answer is yes, absolutely. There's an $882 million request in there to really begin to chip away at that backlog of 45 projects. And so we will earnestly work to chip away at that backlog, but we also have to be reminded that in addition to the FY22 ask, in the Americans Jobs Plan, there's another $5 billion request for Superfund and Brownfield sites as well. So our budget request is the beginning of what we need to do to earnestly begin to look at cleaning up Superfund sites.
Well, thank you so much. Now, it's also important to me that polluters pay the cost of these cleanups, and that's why I reintroduced the Superfund Polluter Pays Act to reinstate the Superfund tax. And obviously that was included in the president's American Jobs Plan as well, to bring back the tax. So can you talk very briefly about why reinstating the tax, what reinstating the tax would mean for the Superfund program, and how would the program be improved by reestablishing a dedicated significant funding stream?
When we look at the number of Superfund sites all across this country, they're in all of our backyards. And so the projects right now exceed the revenue. And the president has supported in the American Jobs Plan the tax. Listen, we believe that this requires an all hands on deck. In our 2022 budget request, there are resources. There's the tax implication here that could provide a revenue stream. And then there's the American Jobs Plan. We know that if we clean up these Superfund sites, that we'll be putting people back to work, but more importantly, we will be restoring these lands so that they can be competitive once again for economic development and community vitality. And so this is extremely important that we have all of these legs of the stool.
And let me ask you this, like so many of these environmental challenges, climate change threatens to make the risk from Superfund sites even worse. And many of the communities around the Superfund sites now live in fear of the toxic releases, from another hurricane or extreme weather event. I know a lot of environmental justice communities are near these Superfund and Brownfield sites, and this is something that you've championed, addressing the concerns of environmental justice communities. So do you agree that climate change makes it even more imperative that we get these sites cleaned up? That's my question.
Absolutely. And you will see a reflection in the budget. Climate change permeates through Superfund, Brownfields, water infrastructure. We have to make sure that we are rebuilding a resilient community in all of these areas to reduce the threats that we're facing.
And I know that, obviously you want to work with us to clean up these sites, but I just want a sort of a pledge from you, if you will, that you and other agencies, would really prioritize these sites that are vulnerable to climate change, if you will.
I can commit that to you, Chairman.
And I really appreciate your being here and your support of so many of these things, particularly Superfund and Brownfields. The problem, as you know, is that if we don't have a Superfund tax, then the costs continue to be borne in many cases by the taxpayer through their income tax. I mean, you would agree with that, certainly, correct?
Yes, I would.
And I just don't want that to be the case. I think that the cost should be borne by the polluters and by the chemical and petroleum industry, and not by taxpayers with their income tax. So thanks again for all your support, and I know you're doing a great job. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You're welcome. And the gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes Representative Rogers, the ranking member of the full committee, for 5 minutes for questioning, please. Representative Rogers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And again, hello, Administrator Regan. We really appreciate you spending this time with us. And just kind of following up on Chairman Pallone's line of questioning, I wanted to highlight some of the successes of the previous administration. When you consider that that the EPA deleted all or parts of 27 sites from the Superfund National Priorities List. It was the largest number of deletions in 2 decades. Yes, there's still more work to be done, but this was a priority, and we must stay focused on getting results. The EPA delivered approximately $295 million in brownfield grants directly to communities and nonprofits in need. I know in Spokane we've had a brownfield cleaned up, and it's now just a great contributor to our community. The EPA closed on 41 WIFIA loans, which led to financing of $16.8 billion for water infrastructure, creating more than 38,800 jobs and saving ratepayers nearly $4 billion. There were management reforms, such as 33% improvement in on-time completion of inspections and a reduction in backlog permits by 150. The combined air pollution emissions fell more than 7%, even as the economy grew. And I just highlight this because we continue to build on this record of success and accomplishments. I believe that we need to stay focused on results. We need to stay focused on making sure that we're spending money in a way that's actually going to get results. And it's very important that we keep the processes and programs that produce these results in place. The EPA received $9.34 billion in roughly the last year for its standard fiscal year appropriations, as well as the supplemental funding. Included in the supplemental funding is $100 million appropriated to the EPA under the recent budget reconciliation bill. This week, Senator Capito and I sent you a letter requesting an accounting of that $100 million appropriated to EPA through reconciliation. Are you able to tell us today if that $100 million has been spent? And if so, what have the funds been spent on?
I will circle with my staff. I know that request came in, and I have not been briefed on that yet, but we can get you those details. Okay, thank you. I wanted to switch gears a little bit on a matter that's important in my home state of Washington, and that's cleaning up Puget Sound. And I wanted to raise this issue with you this morning, Administrator Regan. I think we all agree that, generally speaking, it's better to limit pollution at the source rather than continuing to try to clean up efforts post-pollution. And I think that we agree that the deployment, I hope we'd agree that carbon-free, renewable, reliable electric generation like hydropower is very important. In Puget Sound, we continue to have a lot of work that needs to be done. And a clean sound will benefit our economy, will also help the critical salmon stocks in the Pacific Northwest. One of the main reasons that the Puget Sound is dirty is because King County and the state of Washington is turning a blind eye to the pollution, to the sewage discharge that continues to happen in Puget Sound. There's over 70 sewage treatment plants dumping millions of gallons of raw sewage into Puget Sound every year. And it is threatening the salmon species in Puget Sound, the salmon species that are critical to the orcas, for example. But it's really concerning that once again, these permits are going to be issued instead of actually stopping the dumping of the raw sewage. You look at the Washington State Salmon Report, the Puget Sound salmon are in crisis. Having EPA remind the state and the city of its legal obligations will save future cleanup dollars. And so I wanted to ask you if I can get your commitment to look into making these large cities like Seattle stay within their limits of sewage discharge, just like the small towns in Eastern Washington are forced to do. Yes, you have my commitment there, and I've already committed to the governor of Washington and other representatives that we want to work with the state to be sure that their delegated authority is being done correctly. And I agree with you that the Puget Sound is not only great ecologically, but provides economic opportunities as well. So we want to partner with you on that.
Well, what's happening right now is unacceptable, in my opinion, for the salmon, for the orcas, and for our water quality. So I look forward to working with you, and with that, I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You're welcome. The gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes for 5 minutes of questioning the gentlelady from Colorado, who also serves as subcommittee chair on Oversight, Representative Taguette.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and welcome, Administrator Regan. We're very happy to have you in your maiden appearance in front of this committee, and we all welcome your new role. We know you've got a really big job to do over there, reconstituting this agency, but we have the faith that you can do it. As Chairman Taco just said, I'm the chair of the Oversight Subcommittee, and the last, Ms. Mark Rogers was talking about what the last administration did. But one thing I will say is the Oversight Subcommittee made numerous requests for information to the EPA that were never, ever responded to. And so I know that you and your new job and your staff will want to work with our full committee and our subcommittee to make sure that when we ask for information in our investigations, we get it in a timely fashion. So can I get that commitment from you?
Absolutely.
Thank you. I was, when I looked at the EPA budget, I was absolutely thrilled to see your request for $936 million towards a new accelerating environmental and economic justice initiative, because this is an issue that I've worked on with my urban district for many, many years. And I have a bill. I'd like to ask you to have your staff take a look at this bill and see what the EPA's position on it. What it does is it requires the EPA to identify 100 environmental justice communities which have seen the worst under-enforcement and to work with the state and local co-regulators to address its root causes. I don't know if you're familiar with this legislation yet or not.
I'm not quite familiar with that legislation, but I will be sure that staff connects with you to provide the technical assistance needed.
It seems like this is something that we could really work together on. I've got an area in the northern part of my district that has been an environmental justice area for decades, Swansea, Elyria, Globeville. I think the members of this committee are getting sick of me hearing to talk about it, but it has everything. It has got a highway going through, it has lead, it has factories on the other side of the boundary. And so we've been doing everything for many years to get that cleaned up. Do you think that the EPA, that it'll be a focus of the EPA to actually work with state and local co-regulators to clean up these sites all around the country? Because that seems to be a key issue for me.
Absolutely. The resources that we get through the budget, through the Americans Jobs Plan, and the resources that we were appropriated through the American Rescue Plan are all designed to partner with state and locally elected officials, as well as community members. You all know your communities better than the federal government ever could, so we need that level of partnership to be successful.
Okay, thanks. Another topic I want to talk to you about, that's the issue of methane. As you know, yesterday the Senate passed a resolution of disapproval for the Trump administration's rollback of the EPA's methane regulations. And I'm the lead sponsor, along with several of our colleagues, Mr. Peters and others in the House. And I'm assuming the EPA supports that resolution of disapproval.
We look forward to working with the decision that Congress has made, and we're poised to look forward to a methane regulation that should be coming forth in September. As
Great.
you know, this is something that API and the Chamber has asked for as well. So we look forward to working on that.
Wonderful. Now, here's an issue. I don't know if you know the answer, if someone at your agency knows the answer, but one of the issues we've had with methane regulation is because of the way they do the detection and testing, you can often have methane emissions happening for months without detection. We are now developing technology to do continuous emissions monitoring on methane waste. Do you know if they're able to do that technologically yet? And is the EPA working with industry to make that happen?
That will be part of the discussion that we have through our regulatory process. And, the good news is many technologies and opportunities have evolved since the previous rule. So we'll be taking advantage of all of the gains that have been made over the past few years.
Great. Thank you very much. And I'm really looking forward to working with you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
The gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes for 5 minutes Representative Johnson, gentleman from the state of Ohio.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Administrator Regan, for joining us today. Last week, while speaking at the White House Climate Summit, President Biden announced a new, quote, nationally determined contribution, a document submitted to the United Nations which outlines how his administration intends to dramatically cut greenhouse emissions in the United States by 2030. The sectors impacted include power generation, transportation, manufacturing, and agriculture. No part of American life goes untouched. According to this document, National Climate Advisor Gina McCarthy and the White House staff conducted a detailed analysis on how to achieve these drastic emissions, the emissions cuts, in consultation with cabinet agencies, including yours, Mr. Regan, the EPA. After completing its so-called analysis, the document says that the Biden administration then turned to, quote unquote, activists and advocates and activists for advice, and also other entities such as universities, businesses, and local governments. So, Mr. Regan, would you briefly describe EPA's role in this process and the related interagency process? How did it work?
Well, the administration's climate NDC process was a whole of government process. So,
well, did you participate directly?
So our agency provided qualitative information around what our regulations could do and the role that they play in sort of the emissions profile. We house the greenhouse gas inventory.
So but you did not participate directly? It was members of your staff?
Yeah, our staff coordinated with the White House staff, shared the qualitative analysis of our statutory and regulatory authority, as well as the contents that we contain in the greenhouse gas inventory.
I find it interesting that this in-depth analysis didn't include direct participation by you, Administrator Regan. Let me go on for the.
What I would say is my staff received direction from me to provide the relevant information for EPA's participation in the development of that number.
Okay, but you didn't directly provide any feedback, is what I'm hearing. For the stakeholders that were consulted, were they representative of all economic sectors of the United States?
I can't speak to the stakeholders that the White House engaged. I can speak to EPA's participation in that process. Now, what I can say is...
Well, what was, Administrator Regan, what was the EPA's role then in developing or analyzing sector-specific pathways for emissions reductions? And will you provide the analyses that you relied upon or that your agency relied upon? Will you provide that analysis for the record?
So EPA provides the greenhouse gas analysis that characterizes the emissions profile for all of these sectors.
Okay, so can you provide what you guys used for the record?
Yeah, we can provide the contents of the greenhouse gas inventory that characterizes the emissions profiles of the individual sectors.
What I'm looking for is what EPA's role was in developing or analyzing the sector-specific pathways for those emission reductions. And that's what I'd like you to provide to this subcommittee for the record. Can you do that?
What I can provide to the subcommittee, just to be sure we're communicating consistently, is the contents of the greenhouse gas inventory and the qualitative analysis that describes the statutory authority and the regulative participation that we would have.
I'm running out of time, Mr. Regan. The nationally determined contribution submitted to the UN identified pathways to meet the specific economic sector targets. Were cost estimates developed for these targets?
You know, that analysis was done by the White House, and that's why I want to be sure
you don't have any insights into that. Has the EPA started its action development process for developing regulations to meet these nationally determined contribution goals?
Our process is we develop rules specifically, and we do that through the regulatory process, which is completely transparent.
I know what the regulatory process is, but for this specific nationally determined contribution document, have you started developing the regulations to meet those goals?
Some we are in process of, and some we're not. The contribution from, let's say, cars, we'll be proposing a tailpipe emission standard in mid-July. For the role of methane, we'll be proposing a rule in September. And as you all know, I've committed to engaging on the replacement of the Clean Power Plan. All of these are contributors to how we get to the emissions targets. But I need to be very specific. Those are not predetermined numbers or outcomes. That's a process that we go through in a transparent manner with all of our stakeholders.
All right,
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, I apologize. We ran over. I yield back.
Okay, the gentleman yields back. Now the chair will recognize the gentlelady from Illinois, Representative Schakowsky, who also serves as chair of the subcommittee on Commerce and Consumer Protection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much. And I want to give a special welcome to our Administrator Regan for being here and to congratulate you for this really wonderful position that you have right now. I'm so glad you're there. And I am very glad to see that the fiscal year 2022 budget includes $3.6 billion invested in critical drinking water infrastructure and creating jobs. But really, this is just a small part of the water infrastructure request that goes along with the American Jobs Act. $111 billion over 8 years. And I want to tell you, the issue of lead in water is a huge one in Chicago. Actually, I didn't know how big it was until the vice president came here to Chicago a few weeks ago and informed me that Illinois has about 25% of all lead service pipelines in the country. That includes the city of Chicago, and a part of which is part of my district. I was so pleased to see last night the president saying that 100% of the lead pipes are going to be replaced. We all know the problem with lead, especially with children. Lifelong effects, irreversible effects having to do with cognition and focus and ability to achieve. So we have to deal with this. What I want to ask you is how much would these proposed investments in drinking water infrastructure contribute to lead service lines removal in places like the city of Chicago?
Well, thank you for that question. And, you know, in the American Jobs Plan, the president has carved out $45 billion to replace 100% of the lead pipes. And we would be executing this program through an existing program at EPA. We wouldn't be recreating the wheel. It would be done through EPA's Drinking Water State Revolving Fund and our Water Infrastructure Improvements for the Nation's grant. So those two programs have a track record of pushing resources around water infrastructure to not only deal with infrastructure and water quality, but to help create jobs as well. And so we'll have a process and criteria set up to be sure that those resources are distributed equitably, and they also will focus on, in the broader context of the $111 billion, water affordability as well.
Now, you were mentioning grants. Are these competitive grants that states and localities are going to have to apply for?
You know, I think what I'd like to do is provide that sort of grant process information for you. I think we have a couple of grant programs. Obviously, the needs are great here, but we do know that most of our cities and municipalities cannot afford to take out loans, and so we do emphasize that grants are important, and we want to be sure that everyone's competitive for those resources.
Great. So, you know, Chicago residents that are most impacted by lead service lines are often in communities of color and more low-income communities. So, Mr. Regan, how does investing in drinking water infrastructure contribute to your environmental justice agenda?
It contributes significantly. We know that we need to implement programs that provide more air quality monitoring, but we also know that water quality is a critical component. Good, clean drinking water is a must in this country, and too many of our disproportionately impacted communities, both communities of color and low income, do not have enough access to clean quality drinking water. So that is a priority for us, and it's a priority as part of our environmental justice and equity programs.
I know, we know that there are literally millions of homes and daycare centers that are affected, and we have to just make sure that we can do that. I am almost out of time, and I can submit the rest of my questions in writing, but I certainly will be watching for the focus on lead, which can be so devastating when it's in the pipes and the service lines. And I thank you for your focus on that, and I yield back.
Thank you.
Gentlelady yields back. We now recognize the gentleman from Oklahoma, Representative Mullen, for 5 minutes, sir, please.
Thank you, Chairman, and I appreciate your all's patience with me. I've been traveling. I got bad reception is throughout Oklahoma, or my district is pretty bad. I don't know if you guys have already tried to address it, but Director, they've already tried to address your mic yet? Because your mic is really bad on our end. It's very hard to hear you. I can't even hear you now.
Nobody's saying anything.
My microphone?
Yes. It's real hard to hear, and I don't know, Chairman, if you can pause my time a little bit so we can get that fixed, because it's hard for us to hear him, and it's pretty distracting.
Is there?
What about now? Can you guys hear me now?
It's still kind of scratchy. Is any way we can take like a minute or two to see if we can address the technology?
Yes, we'll take a minute on our end here and see if we can resolve it.
Okay, thank you. Representative Mullen, hold on. We'll be with you in a minute or two.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, you ought to keep talking to see if it is getting any better, maybe.
They've got the EPA team in
Can we get it fixed?
I believe we have, so thank you. So your 5 minutes will start now, please.
Thank you, sir. Chairman, thank you for working with me on that. And Director, we really appreciate you working with it too, and your time being with us. Look, we understand this. The EPA is sometimes viewed different, obviously, between Republicans and Democrats. But I think we all will agree we feel like the EPA does play a role in our government, but it's how we approach that. And so, a couple questions I have is, one, do you feel like it's the role of the EPA to create and enforce their own policies, or do you think it's the role to look at the legislation and the meaningful legislation that Congress has passed to create the policies to follow?
Well, thank you for that question. I can answer it very clearly. EPA's role is to follow the law and the laws that Congress has designed and given us to follow. And so we want to be transparent. We want to follow the law and follow the science.
So when you're talking about being transparent, underneath the Obama administration, we didn't really feel like they were as transparent. In fact, when they were working with Congress, they never worked with Congress. It was very difficult. They would go at it alone. They would sometimes make their own policies before even trying to figure out what Congress's intent was. And it seems like the EPA was more used as a political arm and a policy-driven place than it was actually working with Congress. So are you saying underneath your direction, you feel like that the EPA is going to work with Congress regardless of who is in charge? Because, there's a good chance, I'm not trying to be political here, but there's a good chance that there could be a different party in charge of the House of Representatives in 2 years.
Our job is to work with every single member, and that's what I did in North Carolina. We had a Republican-led General Assembly, although I worked for a Democratic governor, and we got a lot of work done. So at EPA, and I've already told all of my senior leadership and my staff, we're going to be transparent. We're going to respond to the IG. We're going to respond to GAO. We're going to respond to congressional members. That's the mandate here.
Good. Listen, I am comparing you to the last administration underneath Obama because there's a lot of look-alike. There's a lot of people that was with that administration that's back with the Biden administration. And underneath the Biden administration, the EPA, it didn't really seem like it wanted to work with industry on best business practices. In fact, it seemed like to me, because I'm a product of that. The reason why I'm in Congress today is because of the run-in I had with the EPA back in 2011. Otherwise, I wouldn't even be here. But it seemed like to me back then that they were more interested in giving fines than they were actually working with us, working with the business community, working with our economy. And sometimes the regulations can be detrimental to the industry. Would you commit to working with industry, getting best business practices before you guys roll out something that could actually destroy an entire industry?
We're committed to engaging our regulated community. I have a track record for doing that. We've already been doing that. And on that enforcement piece, one of the things that we've been discussing is having enforcement involved in regulation on the front end helps for the ease of implementation on that back end. We're not into the gotcha games. We want to put out regulations that are easily understood and can be complied with. And so we will be working with our stakeholders to do that.
Do you plan on being heavy-handed with the fines, or do you plan on giving industry an opportunity to fix whatever issue may be up? Because I'll tell you, a lot of times on the state side of it, there's a conflict between state regulations, say in Oklahoma Department of Environmental Quality, versus what EPA is requiring. And as a business owner that has an environmental company, there can be a conflict between those two, and you got to choose which one you're going to follow. You're licensed in your state, but then the EPA can come back on top of it. And we saw with the Obama administration that fines would be levied when you're doing your best as a business owner to try to comply with actually the requirements. But there was no working with industry, and that's why I said working best business practices. And it's a huge concern a lot of business owners like myself have with this new administration, hoping that we don't have a rollback to the way it was handled with the Obama administration.
What I can do is I can pledge that we're going to have strong relationships with our state regulators and with the industry. I personally happen to know and have a relationship with your DEQ secretary there in Oklahoma, and I plan to, as a former state regulator, look at cooperative federalism for what it is and have very strong relationships with our state regulators, and with our business community. Because at the end of the day, we want the best environmental outcomes while we're spurring economic opportunities as well.
Director, I really appreciate that. I really do honestly look forward to working with you. Thank you so much. Appreciate you.
Thank you.
The gentleman yields back, and the chair now recognizes the gentleman from Maryland, Representative Sarbanes. You're recognized for 5 minutes, please.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the hearing. Administrator Regan, welcome to the committee. I have, as I know my colleagues do, great expectations for the EPA under your leadership. Unfortunately, under the last administration, there were a lot of conflicts of interest at the EPA where industries that should be regulated were much too cozy with the agency, and I think it impacted negatively our approach to protecting the environment. So looking forward to your work at the agency. I'm going to be parochial the way some others have been. That's the way this game is played, of course. And so I want to focus, it won't surprise you, on the Chesapeake Bay. First, let me say that I'm gratified that as part of the American Jobs Plan, the administration's focused on environmental restoration and protection. Chesapeake Bay is an economic engine for my home state of Maryland and frankly for the whole region, which is one reason protecting it is so vitally important. So I'm very pleased to see the Biden administration's emphasis on restoration and protection. In the last administration, there were a lot of proposals continuously, unfortunately, to cut funding to critical bay programs. And in addition, there was not the commitment to the kind of cooperative and collaborative leadership across the states in the Chesapeake Bay watershed that we need to ensure the restoration of the bay. An example of that in the last administration was a failure to really have robust enforcement when it comes to that kind of cooperative approach. So I'm hoping that the state and local partners, as well as Bay colleagues in Congress, can count on you to change that, help provide that cooperative framework that we need to meet goals that are coming at us fast. Those are 2025 goals that we are trying to get in place. I know there's an effort underway to reconstitute the position of senior advisor for the Chesapeake Bay and the Anacostia River at the EPA, and that will certainly be helpful. Can you provide some perspective on other plans to work with state, local, and federal partners to meet the goals of the Chesapeake Bay Agreement? Specifically, can we count on you and your staff to use all the tools available to you through the Bay program, through grants, and certainly enforcement authority to ensure that the region is on track to meet those 2025 goals?
Well, thank you for that question. Yes, we are actively focusing on the Chesapeake Bay. We see it as a national treasure and understand the ecological and economic benefits to all of us. We look forward to playing an active role in ensuring that all of the states that have agreed to preserving the Bay do their part and can play their role. And, you know, the details are to follow in the full budget, but what I can say to you is that there is resource support included in this budget focused on the Chesapeake Bay. So we're excited to partner with you and understand, how special it is, not only to the state of Maryland, but to all of us as a country.
Thanks very much. Let me raise another dimension of it, which also calls for collaboration. As you probably know, 80% of the remaining pollutant load reductions that we need to achieve in order to meet these goals come from agriculture. And that means it's imperative that the EPA be working with USDA to ensure that there's sufficient financial and technical assistance in place to provide the Bay region farmers with those tools so that we can get the job done. This is going to take a lot of cooperation, bringing people together. I think the EPA can play a critical role in facilitating that. Can you commit to that? And what steps do you see there that perhaps might be new and different from what has already been done to address these needs. And I have some other questions. I'll make sure I get those submitted in writing to you and your staff, but appreciate your testimony here today. If you could just USDA, EPA connection.
Absolutely. During the nomination process for me in this position and throughout, I've been in close contact with and developing a relationship with Secretary Vilsack. We are committed to partnering. I also, have enjoyed experience with the agricultural community and received a lot of support from the agriculture community because of the work that I've done in the past. So this is not foreign territory for me, and we'll bring all those relationships to bear.
Great. Thanks very much. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Utah, the Representative Curtis. You're recognized for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you very much to our witness today. We hear a lot of clamor about the science involved with climate change. And I can speak personally for me. I don't know of anybody else on this committee that would differ with me that I don't question that science. But there's another aspect of science that we don't talk about a lot, and that's that currently 90% of all carbon emissions come from outside the United States. The U.S. is on track to emit just about 10% of worldwide carbon emissions. And at the same time, China is on a path that greatly increased their emissions for years to come. In other words, the atmosphere doesn't care what country emits the carbon, just how much is in the atmosphere. So, Mr. Director, do you agree with this science that cutting the U.S. carbon emissions in half by 2030 will not have a profound impact on the climate change problem?
I believe that the NDC that the president has set and our approach will have a significant influence on how the world behaves. And collectively, I believe that the world will rally to meet the necessary reductions required.
So, if I might just have a fun moment with you, you sound a little bit like some of my colleagues when they're asked about the science of climate change, which is to really deflect the question and to not answer the question. And really, I think why this is of concern is because we're embarked on a path that will dramatically alter the U.S. economy. And if that really reduces worldwide carbon, then that's something significant, something that we should pay attention to. And I think more of a concern to me is, will you work on policies that only advance policies that actually impact this worldwide carbon rather than just carbon here in the United States? And coming back to the science, carbon doesn't care which country it comes from.
I agree, and I think that when we take a look at what we're doing as a country, it is to mitigate carbon, but it's also to take advantage of technological advancements and to create jobs. So I view the steps that we're taking as hugely impactful on reducing carbon because we're setting the stage, we're leading, but also during that process, we're taking advantage of where the markets are driving us and taking advantage of technologies that I believe we can deploy internationally as well. So in total, I fully believe that the actions that this administration are taking will impact climate change and will create jobs.
Do you agree with the fact that approximately over the last decade, the United States has reduced more carbon than all the carbon reducing countries combined?
Yes, I agree that carbon has been on the decline.
Yeah, and my point with that is that we have been setting an example and the other countries have not been following. Let me switch gears quickly before I run out of time. National ambient air quality standards were designed to help reduce the amount of pollutants that we know cause human health issues. This is a big deal in my state. Utah's really struggled with this. As a mayor, we dealt with PM 2.5 and understand these standards. And I agree we need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. However, the National Ambient Air Quality Standards were clearly never intended to regulate greenhouse gas emissions, nor would it be an effective way to combat global climate change, as we've just talked about, when nearly 9% of emissions come from outside the United States. Are you ready to assure this committee that you have no plans to pursue a greenhouse gas national ambient air quality standard?
I haven't discussed that with anyone. I think that the Supreme Court has given us the authority to regulate greenhouse gases, and we'll use the statutory authority we have to do so.
So it sounds like you are planning to do that. I just want to be clear. I'm not pushing you to a yes or no, but rather just to know exactly what your intentions are.
I'll be honest with you. The statutory authorities that are provided to the agency to regulate greenhouse gases is what we will take a look at. So I have not had any discussions with my staff about solely using the NAAQS or using the NAAQS as a complement. We'll be looking at all of the tools we have to regulate greenhouse gases.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm out of time and I yield my time.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman who is vice chair of the full committee, Representative Clark.
Mr. Chairman?
Recognize for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And I think I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman. Did you say Congresswoman Yvette Clark?
Yes, I did. I guess there was some trouble with the sound, but yes, Representative Clark, you're recognized for 5 minutes, please.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And I thank our ranking member, McKinley, for convening today's hearing on EPA's fiscal year 2022 budget proposal. Let me also thank Administrator Regan for joining us today to offer your testimony and to say that I'm excited about your leadership at EPA. So let's go. After 4 years of witnessing a systemic attempt to dismantle our nation's environmental infrastructure and protections, it's nice to finally see a budget proposal that prioritizes our environment and the well-being of our communities. The transportation sector has recently become the largest source of greenhouse gases in the United States, and vehicle emissions such as particulate matter are a major contributor in cities like mine, Brooklyn, New York, to medical conditions including asthma, heart disease, and premature death. You add to it COVID-19, and it has been a perfect storm. Cleaning up emissions from medium and heavy-duty vehicles in particular is long overdue for the communities living adjacent to highways, ports, freight hubs, with predominantly low-income communities and communities of color. The Biden administration is committed to centering equity in its work, and we need to build on that commitment by taking ambitious action to reduce emissions of both air pollutants and greenhouse gases from heavy-duty vehicles. Do you agree that EPA needs to tackle emissions of nitrogen oxides and greenhouse gases from heavy-duty vehicles as soon as possible in model year 2027? And what is your agency doing right now to start an ambitious rulemaking on this critically important issue?
I do agree that we need to reduce those emissions, and we're taking a very close look at that. We're on target for a light-duty emissions vehicle standard in July, and we're looking at the follow-up to that and heavy-duty vehicles. We're engaging with the industries, and I'm engaging with my staff to take a look at, number one, what does the science call for, not solely from a greenhouse gas standpoint, but as we model out and look at these disproportionate impacts that these emissions are having on moderate to low income communities of color, urban areas, how we take that into consideration as we develop these proposals for rulemakings.
One major tool already at the EPA's disposal is the DARA program, which has been used very effectively for vehicles like school buses to lower harmful emissions and improve air quality in heavily impacted communities. At a time when we need to be focused on tackling the climate crisis and creating good paying jobs, DERA stands out as a prime example of what works. What resources or support does EPA need to ensure that the DERA program is able to benefit the greatest number of people?
Well, thank you for that. I think the DERA program has been extremely successful in terms of Congress's intent and our ability to execute. The DERA program is like a lot of programs. There is more demand than there are resources. What I would say is we have a good track record of getting those resources to those who need them the most to get the biggest bang for the buck. But that program, like many programs, could use financial bolstering, and it would be good for the economy in terms of looking at advanced diesel technology as we segue to electric vehicles. But it's also good for the planet and good for people. So I believe it's an excellent program, and I would say that the demand outpaces the resources.
We also need to be thinking about how we can reduce emissions from refrigerated trucks that transport our food and medications, including our vaccines, from freight depots to restaurants, grocery stores, and pharmacies. Right now, almost all of the trucks are secondary diesel engines that run nearly 24/7 in order to keep contents cold. My legislation, the Freezer Trucks Act of 2021, is modeled after the DERA program and would address this issue by helping to fund electric refrigeration units, as well as the charging infrastructure to support them. Is this something that your agency has been looking into, and do you agree that is an important piece to addressing the impacts of diesel pollution from the transportation sector on the hardest hit communities?
Well, thank you for that, and thank you for your leadership on that. I am not as familiar with that piece of legislation as maybe some of my staff. It is an important piece of the pie, and I can commit that this agency will look into and support you all in your efforts from a technical assistance standpoint any way we can.
Very well. Thank you, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
The gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Representative Crenshaw. You're recognized for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good to be back with you all. Still can't see y'all, so it'll be a few more weeks till that hopefully happens. I'm doing well, and you don't need to feel bad for me. We raise our right hand and then we ask to go to war, and sometimes this is what happens. But I hope to be back to normal within a couple months. But for now, even a blind knuckle dragger can do a hearing. So here I am, and let's get to work. Administrator Regan, thank you so much for being with us, and congratulations on your new position. So I do have some questions. You've said that in your budget proposal, about 8% of the EPA's budget will be used for environmental justice. And as you put it, rewriting the DNA of the EPA. Hoping you can tell us what you mean by that. How do you attach dollars to the notion of implementing environmental justice?
Well, thank you for that question, Congressman, and thank you for your service to this country. Environmental justice and equity will be part of the EPA's DNA. And what I mean by that is there are areas that we can bolster our efforts to be sure that communities that have had the disproportionate impact from pollution no longer suffer disproportionately. And so there are opportunities for us to take a look at overburdened communities to ensure that we have the appropriate air quality monitoring in place, that when we look at water quality needs from an infrastructure standpoint, that many of those communities have good quality drinking water, lead service lines and pipes that are disproportionately impacting communities.
Administrator, since I have limited time, I think your answer so far is fairly reasonable. To be honest with you, that's fine. Thank you for defining that. The concern I have is certain legislation that may may be written into law that you would have to then regulate. The Clean Futures Act, for instance, in Section 601, defines environmental justice rather differently than you just did. It defines it based on 17 principles from the 1991 People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit. Among some of these principles, it states that we must affirm the sacredness of Mother Earth. I'm not sure what that means. It's a bit paganistic. Another principle would say that we must oppose the destructive operations of all multinational corporations. So my question would be, does that make sense to write something like that into law? It's one thing for activists to be saying that kind of rhetoric. It's quite another for that to be written into law, which your agency would have to then regulate. How on earth would you do that?
Well, and thank you for the question. I'm not familiar with that piece of legislation, so I'm not quite sure I can fully answer your question. I think any piece of legislation, we'd like to be sure that, number one, it follows the law and we have the authority to actually execute on what is being asked of us. So I'll take a look at that, but not familiar with it.
Well, thank you, Administrator. I do find it a little hard to believe that you haven't seen that piece of legislation. It's a flagship bill for your party, and it would directly influence everything you do at the EPA. Along the same lines, in Title IX of the Clean Future Act, it effectively bans plastic for the next 10 years, at least puts a pause on it, with the promise of burdensome regulations right after that. Effectively curtailing any kind of investment in new plastic production in the United States. We have some of the best natural gas resin-based plastic production. So the problem is this: there's opposing forces here. On the one hand, the Biden administration wants to implement an enormous infrastructure plan that will require massive new plastic production, whether it's building EV batteries, lightweight materials for EV cars, new syringes and biomedical devices and syringes which we use to vaccinate people, thousands of miles of fiber optic cable wrapped in plastic. But this would be banned, on the other hand, and your agency would be tasked to effectively ban that according to the law. So what would we do?
Well, I want to be clear, honest, and transparent with you. Number one, I'm unfamiliar with the piece of legislation, have not been briefed by my team, which sends a signal to me that it may not be high on our priority. So I'm not in a position to address many of those questions. This is the first time I'm hearing that.
Okay, Administrator Regan, you're saying that no one has consulted with you. You're the expert. You're the head of the EPA, but no one has consulted with you about the Clean Futures Act.
That's exactly what I'm telling you.
Okay. Well, thank you. No further questions. I can't see my time, so maybe I'm over time. And if I am, thank you for allowing me. If not, I yield back.
Okay, the gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Representative Peters. You're recognized for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks you to Administrator Regan for being here. We're eager for your leadership. The Journal of Environmental Research Letters recently published a study showing that steeply limiting or eliminating methane emissions could slow the rate of the Earth's warming by as much as 30%. There's a lot to do on climate, but getting methane out of the atmosphere is critical to keeping warming below the 2 degrees targeted by the Paris Climate Accord. I'm happy to co-sponsor with Ms. DeGette the CRA that will restore the Obama New Source rules. But on methane regulation, I want to point out that we can build back better. Instead of prescribing technology, which is a proxy for lower emissions, we now have the monitoring ability, which we did not have in 2016, to impose direct emission standards. And last week, I introduced the Methane Act that would do just that, direct the EPA to set methane emission limits for oil and gas facilities, reduced over time, encouraging investment in technologies that provide the greatest emission reductions at the lowest cost. So, Mr. Administrator, I ask you to consider this new approach and whether there's a benefit to passing it through legislation that would provide reliability to the environment and to industry. I ask that your budget dedicate the resources under any circumstances to monitor emissions and enforce compliance. And I'm going to ask you to respond to that in writing so I can bring another urgent matter to your attention today. On behalf of the people I represent in San Diego and Coronado, I have to tell you about what has to be one of the most dire environmental catastrophes on the continent. Tens of millions of gallons of raw sewage, human and chemical waste from commercial and industrial facilities are flowing down through the Tijuana River across the U.S.-Mexico border into San Diego communities. This is toxic stuff. When it dries, the dust blows into nearby neighborhoods. The smell and noxious fumes make people sick. Border Patrol agents and Navy SEALs who train to protect our country have to wade and swim through it in and are stricken with skin rashes, nausea, and even their boots disintegrating on their feet because of the chemicals in this sludge. Sewage from Baja California and northern Mexico is being pumped untreated into the ocean, makes its way into San Diego County beaches in a matter of hours. Over the past few weeks, more than 550 million gallons of wastewater was pumped into the ocean just a few short miles south of the border. And within hours, it's on San Diego beaches. People are getting sick, beaches are getting closed. The Tijuana estuary is completely fouled, and this has been going on for far too long. We've worked hard as a congressional delegation to fix the problem and secured more than $300 million as part of the USMCA. We're supporting your agency and IBWC as they plan, design, and permit the big projects we need to address it, but we need action now. This is an international catastrophe. It's happening in a working class, majority minority community in a far corner of our country. So I have to tell you today that these Americans are counting on you and me to fix it. And the best way to describe how much worse the problem has become is by the number of beach closure days at these locations. In 2018, South San Diego County beaches were closed 101 days. 2019, that increased to 243 days. In 2020, 295 days. And in 2021, the beaches have been closed for the entire year. The nearby canyons have experienced toxic, dangerous spills every single day. In August 2020, the governor of Baja California declared the sewer system fixed in Tijuana after they replaced a pump station with the new diversion pumps. Around the same time, the EPA, as part of the USMCA process under President Trump, stated it was not necessary to implement short-term emergency measures to control transboundary flows because Mexico had fixed the pump station. But as I explained, it's now 9 months later. We're still getting daily transboundary flows, and our beaches are still polluted. Can't wait for more public scoping meetings and studies. I'm going to ask you 4 things today. First, we need urgent, immediate fixes, anything to slow the flows. Second, we need a diversion structure built immediately, either through executive order or otherwise fast track. Third, we ask your help in proclaiming the urgency to the administration about the need for the State Department to engage with Mexico and insist that they do their part and build the infrastructure needed to keep up with their population growth. And fourth and finally, and this is the only question I'd ask you to answer today, will you please join Representative Juan Vargas, who represents the border area with me, and me in San Diego soon to see this tragedy for yourself. We desperately need your help, and we'd love to show you the problem that we're facing. Your comments on clean water in your written testimony couldn't have made me feel better about this. And we'd love to have you out in San Diego so we can work on this together. And I'd ask you to come visit us. And with that, I'll take your answer, but I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you. I absolutely would love to visit with you. It's a priority for EPA. I've already spoken with my Mexican counterpart about how urgent this problem is and appreciate the resources that Congress allocated a couple of months ago, and we're working hard on a solution.
Thank you very much. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back, and we now recognize the gentleman from Georgia, Representative Carter. You're recognized for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Administrator, for being here. I appreciate you being here. I wanted to ask you, it's my understanding that that the Paris Pledge commits the United States to a 50% reduction of economy-wide greenhouse gases below the 2005 levels, and we're supposed to reach this by 2030. This is ambitious, to say the least. Last week, the Biden administration filed its nationally determined contribution, or NDC, if you will, with the United Nations under the Paris Agreement. We know that includes plans to pursue aggressive new regulations of the electricity and transportation sectors, but we know that these plans will still leave the administration short of the 50% NDC Paris Pledge. After transportation and electricity, the economic sectors with the highest emissions are industry and agriculture. Can you please tell us if the new regulations on these sectors are part of the president's plan to achieve the NDC?
Well, thank you. I think that our participation in the development of the NDC was to characterize the emissions and then do a qualitative analysis of the regulatory authority we have to pursue it. And so, this is a government-wide approach. This isn't EPA regulate solely your way out of this situation. And so, what I can say is between regulatory and non-regulatory opportunities, I think that the administration wide is all in for looking at this 50% reduction goal. It's not squarely on the shoulders of EPA and EPA's regulatory authority.
But tell me what non-regulatory procedures are. I'm not sure I'm understanding. I want to make sure I understand that.
Well, I think that there are a lot of activities that are occurring in the private sector that we don't regulate. I know for sure in talking with Secretary Vilsack, there are a lot of activities that agriculture is pursuing voluntarily that we don't quantify or don't regulate. And so, again, and then there are lots of other things that happen outside of EPA's scope. I can't speak to the totality of all of the activities, but I can speak to EPA's activities and can assure you that as we develop these regulations that contribute to the NDC, it will be done in a fully transparent manner that will engage all of our stakeholders.
It's important to understand that these sectors, they're not monolithic, of course, and that true transparency requires more information. Can you tell the committee or provide for the record whether or not EPA plans regulations on, let's just say, livestock operations, soil management, iron and steel, cement, municipal landfills, pulp and paper, refineries and petrochemical facilities, aluminum manufacturing, glass manufacturing, soda ash production? All of these things, are you intending to pass regulations on these?
You know, you gave a really long list of which many are already following regulations or have regulations that they're working with the agency on. And so, again, I think that we provided a qualitative assessment of what regulations or what statutory authority Congress has given us that will help contribute to the emission reductions that the NDC speaks to. So, you know, I don't know if the question is asking are there new regulations or how existing regulations complement, but what I will tell you is as we traditionally do when we develop regulations, we engage our stakeholders, those who are in the regulated community, and we plan to do that this time no differently than we always have.
I'm sorry, Mr. Regan, out of all due respect, I'm just having trouble understanding exactly what your plans are. And I think it's very important. You just said that you wanted to be transparent, but I think it's very important we understand. Look, I represent a lot of agriculture. I represent a lot of forestry. And they are not the problem. They are part of the solution. And I want to make sure EPA understands that they are part of the solution.
I think if you were to speak with the ag CEOs across this country and the elected ag officials who supported my nomination, I have a track record of working with agriculture, and I've been working with Secretary Vilsack on how we ensure that agriculture is at the table. So you and I are in agreement there.
I certainly hope so. Mr. Reagan, I appreciate you being here and I appreciate you responding. And I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back, and the chair now recognizes the gentleman from California. Please, you're recognized for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Administrator Reagan. Welcome, and thank you for being here. We speak the same language in environmental justice concerns. I want to start by addressing the EPA's ongoing oversight of the Oasis mobile home park in my district. It's very specific, but it really highlights some of the challenges in environmental justice that your agency is facing. This park is located on tribal private land in a rural farm worker community and has been under an EPA emergency order due to high levels of arsenic in the park's drinking water since August 2019. I am very happy with the administration's efforts on lead in pipe water throughout America. Arsenic is dangerous and causes harmful health effects, and we find arsenic in some of our low-income communities as well. This effort to deal with the emergency order since August 2019, that is more than 20 months ago. I understand EPA's mission is to help water system owners get back into compliance when there is no contamination. However, this assumes that the system owners act in good faith. All public accounts indicate that the owner of Oasis Mobile Home Park has not acted in good faith. Over the past 20 months, park ownership has repeatedly missed EPA deadlines, failed to adequately provide replacement water for residents, threatened evictions, raised rent by more than 30%, and the list goes on, including informing their residents that the water was safe to drink when the EPA had not allowed that or cleared the water to drink, and therefore residents were drinking with this water. As the EPA continues to work with the park, I'm concerned that the focus on compliance is failing to address accountability. And Minister Regan, how will you work to ensure that Oasis residents are protected and that bad actors are held accountable for repeatedly violating EPA orders to provide clean, safe drinking water? You're on mute, sir.
Thank you for that. I fully believe every community deserves clean drinking water. We will continue to partner with your office, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, California's EPA, and ensure that the technical assistance required from our agency is given to the state so that we can ensure that these impacts are remedied.
I understand the technical assistance. My question is accountability. How far is far enough? How long is long enough? We talk about the BIA. The BIA has been negligent and never permitted them to begin with to operate this business, and now they're coming around. So when is enough and hold individuals accountable?
Well, I'll tell you what, I'll look into the particulars of this and speak with my enforcement folks, and we'll get an answer to you on that.
I appreciate working with you because I know in your heart you're about helping the environmental justice community. And at the core, this is an environmental justice issue. This is about the decisions and actions of the powerful affecting the health and well-being of the powerless. In my remaining time, I'd like to ask you about another element of the EPA's EJ mission. The American Rescue Plan included my bill, the Environmental Justice for Coronavirus Affected Communities, which provided EPA with $100 million for both environmental justice grants and air monitoring grants under the Clean Air Act. Community groups in my district, such as Alianza and Leadership Council, have long been advocating for better air monitoring in the Coachella Valley. My district faces a range of respiratory threats, from the particulate matter from the Salton Sea to agricultural burns and smog pollution. Yesterday, the Washington Post reported that, quote, nearly every source of the nation's most deadly air pollutants disproportionately affect Americans of color, unquote. This makes it that much more important that the affected communities have access to the funding meant to protect them. And Minister Regan, what is the status of this funding, and how is your office making sure that communities like mine are notified of these resources and that they are able to access these critical funds?
Well, thank you for that. Thank you for your leadership on this. And we're in the process right now of developing the criteria to administer these funds. And what I can tell you is what we did immediately was we engaged the communities to be sure that they were a part of our criteria and decision-making for those who actually receive these funds. So it's a priority for us. We thank you for the resources that we received recently, and we're on the ball.
Administrator Regan, I'm a doctor in public health and emergency medicine. You cannot disassociate our environmental health with our public health and individuals' health. Part of our chronic health disparities is due to the chronic exposure to toxins in our water and air. And if we're going to address the pandemic appropriately and the chronic health disparities and the health of the American people, we need to address environmental justice. You're the guy that's going to help us get it done. And let's work together to ensure that every child can drink clean water and every family can breathe clean air in America. I yield back my time.
Thank you,
gentlemen. The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentle lady from the state of Michigan. Representative Dingell, you're recognized for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for today's important, and thank you, Administrator Regan, for being here, and congratulations on your historic appointment. Under the last administration, EPA ignored pressing environmental risks and moved the United States in the wrong direction on so many essential environmental protections. With your historic appointment, EPA is back in action. Sound science is the guide to policy. You've taken over this agency at a critical time, and your to-do list is long. And I care about most of your to-do list. So there's a lot of ground to cover, so I'm going to move fast. fuel economy. I'm a car girl. Applaud the Environmental Protections Agency proposal to restore California's authority to set its own emission standards. Yes, I support California. After the previous administration stripped this authority from the state of California and caused serious uncertainty to the auto industry. Thank you for clarifying earlier EPA's timeline for reviewing the GHG and the fuel economy stands, but I need to dig deeper. As I understand it, due to lead time requirements, EPA will not be able to set a new rate until 2023, and NHTSA won't be able to set it until 2024. So just the delay in all of this is moving it down the line. It obviously worries many of us because we want to see the industry moving forward. Can you walk me through how compliance will work for model years 21 and 22? Are Trump standards enforced for the companies that didn't sign on to the California framework, or at least for the non-Section 177 states? And will the Section 177 states enforce at the Obama standard level for those years? What role does California play? And I'm concerned that the Trump standards might persist. And I think we all need to have a better understanding about what you're thinking about this. And I want to make sure the companies that did sign on to the California aren't disadvantaged. So I think the industry is looking for some clarification.
Well, we're engaging directly with the industry and with states like California. Number one, I believe in the statutory authority that California has, that states should be able to lead. So we want to be sure that we follow the law, and we've followed the first step of a two-step process to do that. Listen, I think that we all have to live with the fact that we lost a few steps during the past administration. And so we have to go through a regulatory process, which the president has indicated he wants to see a new proposed rule by July. All hands on deck. We are working extremely hard to do that. And while this first step does focus on model years through 2026, we're going to be very aggressive there. We also know that we have a second bite at the apple beyond model years 2026, and we have a rulemaking process there as well. And so, regrettably, we've lost a step in terms of emission reductions, but we're coming back and focused on how we make up for that lost time. And I can assure you, we're having conversations not only with the automobile industry, but the unions as well. I believe that what the science requires for us to do, where the industry is moving, and a manner by which we can do it to keep these jobs domestically is within our reach.
I want to work with you on that, and I hope that we get to know each other and help in that. But I want to hit another subject before I'm out of time. If you come from Michigan, you know about you worry about clean water, and you worry about what my other colleagues have raised about the pandemic has really made us focus on water as a human right. We tell people to wash their hands, and many people have had their water turned off, and they don't have access to clean water for public health, sanitary conditions. Water is life. I've been encouraging this administration to do an executive order preventing water shutoffs nationally, and especially while HHS has yet to fully implement and deploy money from the Low-Income Household Water Assistance Program, a new assistance program that Congress authorized in December through this committee with my colleague Rashida Tlaib and I leading on. Can you tell me what efforts are underway at EPA to ensure every American has access to clean water during this ongoing global health pandemic? And how do you plan to tackle the water debt crisis across so many communities?
That's an important piece of the fiscal year 2022 budget, but it's really prominently featured in the American Jobs Plan. What we need to do while we're assessing and looking at water infrastructure is ensuring that we pay attention to water affordability as well. I believe that we can focus on quality and affordability at the same time. And EPA has a track record in our loans and grant programs where we do just that. We focus on fixing the problem, providing quality water, and there's a significant focus on water affordability as well. And that's where grants primarily become the option versus loans. It's a very serious issue, and we're grateful in the American Jobs Plan that the president's focused on this.
Let's just try to not turn off anybody's water during this pandemic, and this administration needs to make sure that happens. I beg you. Thank you. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from California. Representative Barragan, you are recognized for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair Tonko. The proposed $2 billion increase for the EPA budget is very promising, especially the focus on investing in programs that address clean air and clean water and environmental justice communities. In my district, the Port of Los Angeles is both a major economic engine that provides jobs, but it's also a source of pollution. This is a public health burden for communities of color in South Los Angeles, and it's an environmental justice issue felt by communities near ports around the country. Administrator Regan, can you please describe how EPA's proposed budget will help improve air quality at ports? And would you agree that this type of work is central to realizing the administration's climate and environmental justice goals?
Well, thank you for that question, and it is central. And when we look at our budget request of 2022, but also when we look at the American Jobs Plan, the American Jobs Plan really features resources that we can deploy to take a look at the impacts that ports are having on our communities. There are resources in there that really focus on how we get more air quality monitoring in these communities that are disproportionately impacted. But there are also grant dollars that would flow through the agency to these communities to do a lot of work in terms of how we develop partnerships with the communities and the ports to ensure that we have the best management practices in place, that we understand from an air quality monitoring standpoint what's happening on the ground, such that our regulations are accommodating to reducing the threat that emissions from ports have, not only on the climate, but also on our vulnerable communities.
And would you agree that the EPA has the experience and the expertise needed to establish and implement a program specifically focused on decarbonizing ports?
We have the experience. We just need the resources.
Well, it's definitely worth noting that the American Jobs Plan seeks to invest heavily in efforts to reduce emissions from ports, in turn creating paying high-quality jobs. Mr. Administrator, I want to shift a little to a bill that I have. It's called the Climate Smart Ports Act. It establishes an EPA grant program to help ports purchase and install zero emissions equipment and technology. These investments will address major sources of emissions from port infrastructure and the ships and trucks and trains that serve ports, while also cleaning up the air that nearby communities breathe. House Democrats have introduced legislation called the Clean Future Act, and we believe that this bill can help implement parts of the American Jobs Plan. Do you believe that legislation should include port electrification and decarbonizing program so that we can help meet these goals of the American Jobs Plan?
You know, I'd love to take a look at that legislation. I've been on the job for about a good 6 weeks now. I haven't had a chance to look at all the legislation that has been raised today. But I do believe that if we can advance electrification in our ports and in our transportation, it will only help from an air quality standpoint as well as a climate standpoint.
Great. And the EPA, now to want to turn something more local, the EPA is investigating a former industrial site in my district called Central Metal for eligibility on the Superfund National Priorities List. It was used for recycling scrap metal up until 2016. The EPA is supposed to test the soils in nearby neighborhoods this year for contamination. This facility was allowed to operate for 15 years, so close to a district that's majority Latino and African American. It's an example of the kind of environmental injustice we need to prevent. Residents complained for years about bad odors, metallic taste in their mouths, loud noises, and bad truck traffic. I will invite you and the EPA and hope that we can work together closely with our office to move as quickly as possible to evaluate and, if necessary, remediate the Central Metal site. Thank you again, Administrator Regan, for your leadership, and look forward to working with you. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you.
The agenda recognizes the gentleman from Virginia, Representative McKeith. The rest is for 5 minutes, please. Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, as always, for convening today's hearing and for on this important subject of fiscal year 2022 EPA budget. Mr. Regan, it's good to see you again, Director Regan. As a founding member of the United for Climate and Environmental Justice Task Force, along with my colleague, Congresswoman Nanette Barragan and Congresswoman Jayapal, and as a proud lead sponsor alongside Chairman Grijalva of the Environmental Justice for All Act, I was heartened to see the Justice 40 initiative included in the President's Executive Order 14008 on tackling climate change. This initiative is critical, and I'm excited to partner with you on this work. Administrator Regan, how will your office work with communities that are most impacted to communicate the new funding opportunities under your EPA leadership?
Well, thank you for that question. And, I've directed every office within the agency to look at how environmental justice and equity is integrated into our policies, our regulations, our contracting, and our procurement. So we do have a formal education and outreach arm that will do a lot of the outreach, but I have the expectation that every single office has the accountability to engage with the communities that they do business with regularly, whether that be regulations, policy, and or grant or loan programs.
Administrator, I need you to educate me a little bit on how your agency is working with CEQ on establishing what programs and investments will count towards the 40%.
Very strong partnership there. The CEQ just confirmed the nominee, and so we've had an introductory meeting, and we're mapping out.
Better. Communities that have been historically left behind must be prioritized. 40% should be the floor, quite frankly, not the ceiling. And I look forward to seeing how the American Jobs Plan can help meet that goal. Moving on to EJ screening, I believe that the EPA's EJ screening tool has the potential to be incredibly helpful, not only for communities, but for policymakers. Being able to better identify impacted communities will allow for more thoughtful considerations when it comes to permitting, enforcement, and overall prioritization of revitalization and mitigation efforts. Mr. Administrator, can you tell us how the EPA is working in tandem with OMB and CEQ to create a tool that accurately identifies environmental hazards and impacted communities?
Well, this is very important, and this is something that I have experience in doing in North Carolina. You're exactly right. If we have the right tools, the right screening tools, local economic developers, chambers of commerce, lots of individuals are interested in that information so that they can do the appropriate planning. No one wants to run afoul of the law or be accused of disproportionately impacting anyone. And so I plan to bring that recipe to EPA as we work with CEQ and OMB to ensure that our screening tools don't only empower us as the regulator, but empower the very people who have to make decisions on the ground. Many times are making decisions because they lack the information that we can provide.
You know, Mr. Administrator, the notion of cumulative impact, to my mind, is awfully important. Do you envision this tool helping to identify cumulative impacts that a community may be subject to?
We believe that it can inform us on cumulative impacts, and we're in conversations, or I'm in conversations right now with my general counsel and the experts here in the agency to determine if we have all the tools we need to adequately address cumulative impact, or do we need more assistance from Congress? And we look forward to partnering with you on answering that question.
And to the extent that you feel like you need more assistance, please holler. We want to make sure that we have cumulative impacts appropriately identified and make sure that we're protecting these communities from any further damage. Mr. Chairman, EJ screen is a critical piece of the puzzle when it comes to prioritizing and identifying communities most at risk. I look forward to working with EPA to address cumulative impacts, enforcement, and investment as we continue our work with the agency. Mr. Chairman, I thank you for your time and your attention, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. We thank you. And the chair will now recognize the gentlelady from the state of Delaware, Representative Blunt Rochester. You're recognized for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and especially for calling this important hearing. And Administrator Regan, congratulations. It's good to see you in your new role, and thank you for your testimony here today. Like my colleagues, Representative Regan and Dingell, I'm working on and have introduced legislation such as my Climate Action Planning for Ports bill, or working on affordable, accessible, and clean water issues. But today I'd like to focus on clean air. Last week, the American Lung Association released their annual State of the Air report, showing that 40% of Americans live in areas where the air is unsafe to breathe. 40%. Clearly, we still have a lot of work to do to clean up our air. The report also reminded us that we need to improve our air monitoring system. Fewer than 1/3 of US counties have monitors, meaning that families don't have access to real-time information about the air they are breathing. Frontline communities have been subjected to unsafe air for decades and have suffered the long-term health consequences and complications because of it. COVID-19 has only exacerbated this and shown us just how dangerous air pollution is to human health, particularly in our frontline communities. One step in empowering and protecting these communities is figuring out what pollutants they are currently exposed to. That is why I introduced the Public Health Air Quality Act, and I am proud it is included in the Clean Future Act. This bill will significantly improve and expand our air quality monitoring network and make sure EPA has the resources it needs. Administrator Regan, I'd ask that my staff continue to work with your office, and I would love to have a commitment that you will work with us on some of those important issues.
Well, thank you. You do have my commitment, and I will say that in our 2022 budget and in the ARP, this is exactly why we've requested resources for air quality monitoring. It's a very important piece of the puzzle.
Thank you so much. As a matter of fact, you preempted me. In the American Rescue Plan, we appropriated $50 million to EPA for air quality monitoring programs under the Clean Air Act. What progress has EPA made in getting the $50 million out the door, and what will that money accomplish?
You know, it will accomplish a lot. And what we've done is we've started the process of engaging directly with our communities that have been overburdened to determine and ascertain where these monitors should be placed and the types of information that we should be collecting. We didn't want to rush and be paternalistic. We wanted to engage the communities, get their buy-in. The $50 million is going to be a good shot in the arm. The $100 million, as we've asked for in the 2022 budget, will be another shot in the arm. But we need to keep right on pressing on this air quality issue.
Could you delve a little bit deeper? I was pleased to see that your discretionary budget request asked for that $100 million for a new community air quality monitoring and notification program. Can you talk a little bit more about it? What goals do you have for the funding and the new program?
Well, it's really designed to better inform our air quality monitoring system. This isn't a situation where government wants to grow and build. This is an opportunity for us to give grants directly to the states, to the tribes, and to the communities, arm them with the information on how to use these resources so that they can begin to monitor their air quality themselves, and then communicate with us as the federal government so that we can partner with these local communities and these states. This is extremely important and a really good step forward in terms of building the confidence that we need our communities to have in their federal government.
And my last question is do you need more to repair and expand on the air quality monitoring system? In particular, do you have sufficient staff to address these challenges?
You know, we have taken a serious hit in staff over the past 4 years. Over close to 1,000 people have walked out of the door. We're hoping to recoup some of that lost expertise. I will say we are making progress with this 2022 ask, the resources that the president is calling for in the American Jobs Plan. You know, we really want to fight for those precious resources, and they will get us on our way.
Thank you, Mr. Administrator. And also, I want to say on behalf of my sister, she too has Aggie pride. So welcome, welcome, and we're glad to have you on this mission. Thank you, sir. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Hey, thank you. The gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Florida, Representative Soto. You're recognized for 5 minutes, please, and thank you for joining.
Thank you, Chairman Tonko, and welcome, Administrator Regan. Appreciate your leadership on EPA. In Florida, we face intensifying hurricanes, rising sea levels, and if we do nothing to bend the curve on emissions, we'll see over 100 extremely hot days a year by 2050. We know we have to do something about it, which is why I'm so excited about President Biden's goal of cutting U.S. greenhouse gas emissions in half by 2030, which reflects this urgency. According to a recent New York Times report, new data shows methane levels in the atmosphere reaching record high levels last year. If the 2020 rescission rule remains in effect, would U.S. still be on track to make the methane reductions necessary to limit warming by 1.5 degrees and avoid the worst climate harms and meet the president's climate targets?
Well, based on the activities that are occurring with the CRA, what I will say is we're on target to propose a new regulation in September that would be on track with helping to get the deep cuts in methane emissions to help, in part, meet the president's goal. We're excited to say that we're engaging with the industry because the technology exists, and we're going to keep forging ahead.
So with these new protections to protect our air and atmosphere from methane at high levels, it looks like we'll stay on track. Thank you, Mr. Administrator. In addition, we're really appreciative of the 21% increase in drinking water infrastructure. We've seen some issues with some of the cleaning resin affecting water infrastructure in Central Florida and the city of St. Cloud in my district. We're also really excited about the increase from $682 to $882 million for the Superfund sites because we have an issue still with phosphogypsum stacks, both in Polk County as well as in Piney Point, which you may have seen just recently. Can we count on you to commit, if we get this increased funding, to help clean up these sites and hold polluters accountable for these phosphogypsum stacks in Central Florida and Tampa Bay?
Yes, we've been in close communication with the state of Florida on these issues. We see an effective partnership occurring with the state, and we'll continue to be present and provide resources and technical assistance as needed.
Thank you so much, Mr. Administrator. And finally, I'm very excited to see strong climate leadership from the Biden administration to boldly act on the climate crisis, rebuild our economy, and create millions of good family-supporting jobs in the process. Turning to President Biden's American Jobs Plan, which boldly outlines an economic recovery centered around tackling the climate crisis, how would the investments in the American Jobs Plan address the climate crisis, and what is EPA's role overall?
EPA plays a significant role in, the climate crisis. This is an opportunity for us to look at ways to leverage technology to reduce the harmful pollutants, like you mentioned, with methane. But the reality is that we're going to be living with many of the impacts that we're seeing. And so resiliency is incredibly important. And this is where the $111 billion in water infrastructure is so important. We need a more resilient water infrastructure to withstand not only climate change impacts, but the attacks we're seeing from cyber issues as well. But the good news is that not only are we hardening that structure, we're creating millions of jobs and creating opportunities to provide good quality drinking water. And by the way, in states like North Carolina and Florida, we need to repair our stormwater so that we can decrease the flooding that we're seeing because of inadequate infrastructure, as well as our wastewater treatment facilities overflowing as well. So pollution reduction, resiliency, jobs, good quality drinking water, there are huge opportunities for EPA in the jobs plan.
Mr. Administrator, I'm glad you mentioned the stormwater issues. We just saw a grant be awarded to our district just yesterday from the HUD resiliency grants that came about through reaction and response to Hurricane Irma in Buenaventura Lakes in my district. So we strongly encourage you to continue working with your partners in HUD on those stormwater resiliency methods, as well as with utilities. We're only going to get stronger hurricanes, both in the outer banks of North Carolina and South Carolina, as well as in Florida. So we look forward to continuing to work with you, and thank you so much for your leadership.
The gentleman yields back. And now we'll move to a few of our colleagues who have waved on to the subcommittee. We'll begin with Dr. Burgess, the gentleman from the state of Texas. You're recognized for 5 minutes, please, sir. Representative Burgess, Dr. Burgess from the state of Texas. If you're with us, I know you wanted to wave on to the subcommittee. You are recognized for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman, for the recognition. Administrator Regan, welcome to our subcommittee. Thank you for testifying today. You spoke just a moment ago to Representative Blunt Rochester from Delaware about having to restore some staffing capacity to the agency. Did I hear you correctly?
Yes.
So at the present time, can you kind of give us a round number figure as to the number of staff that you intend to hire?
Well, over the past 4 years, we lost close to 1,000 employees. And as we look at what's required of the agency to be sure that we're protecting our drinking water and looking at air quality issues as to climate, what this budget does for us is spells out needed resources to get back to where we were prior to 4 years ago, and then assess the additional staff we need to carry out our duties to protect clean air and clean water.
Well, that's very admirable. We want you to have the staff that's required. We'd also like some transparency in the hiring process and how people are apportioned throughout the agency. As you know, our committee is tasked with the oversight of your budget. Do you know what Title 42 hiring authority is?
I'm sorry?
Do you know what Title 42 hiring authority is?
I don't believe I'm familiar with that specific authority.
So years ago, the Environmental Protection Agency was actually part of the Department of Health and Human Services, or perhaps even Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. But there was a Title 42 exception that allowed personnel to be hired at a higher pay rate than to which they would otherwise have had it available to them. And this was the subject of an IG report, and this is back in March of 2015. And Mr. Administrator, I'll be happy to make sure my staff gets a copy of this to you if you don't have it already. The title of the IG, the reporting Inspector General, was EPA needs to justify how it is using Title 42 hiring authority. And here's the concern that and in some of our previous investigative work that we did in previous Congresses, we found, for example, that a starting chemist might be hired at a much higher rate than they otherwise would have been at one of the other agencies. So here's one of the things that has bothered me historically as a member of this committee. It appears that the EPA is using Title 42 of hiring authority despite lacking the authorization to do so from this committee. It was an assumed authorization when the EPA was previously within Department of Health and Human Services and has endured without the proper authorization from the authorizing committee, which would be the Committee on Energy and Commerce. So I guess from your original answer, you're not aware that the EPA was using Title 42 hiring authority despite not having the authorization.
I was just informed by my CFO that we do have the hiring authority. The authorization, excuse me, we do have the authorization.
Well, that's actually been the subject of some debate, and your own Inspector General perhaps felt otherwise. In that 2015 report, your own Office of Inspector General called for the Environmental Protection Agency to justify how it is using that authority. My feeling on this committee, the authorizing committee, that is a legitimate question, and I would just ask you if we can expect to get that question answered.
Yes, I've had a couple of meetings with my IG just as late as this week, and that hasn't come up, but I will circle back with our IG and get that question answered for you.
Good deal. And the only other request, if you do use the Title 42 hiring authority, can you will you help us and commit to us that each hire is properly justified and regularly reported to this committee?
Yes, we want to be transparent and follow the rules and follow the law. So yes.
I appreciate your candor. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the recognition. I'll yield back.
Okay, the gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from the state of Florida, who is also waving on to the subcommittee. She serves as chair of the Subcommittee on Climate. Representative Casper, you have 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Chair Tonko, for allowing me to wave on, and thank you for your leadership. Administrator Regan, it's very good to see you again. The Environmental Protection Agency is central to the ability of our neighbors to lead healthy lives. So I'm grateful to everyone who serves there every day. And it occurred to me just over the past couple of weeks being home here in Tampa, how EPA improves the health and the lives of my neighbors day in and day out. One, I was out at with the university area CDC. They are focused on an at-risk community, and they have used a brownfields assessment grant, and the leaders there said that it has been instrumental in their ability to go into some drug-infested neighborhoods, purchase property, turn that into a park, single-family homes, and they want to do more. So it's good to see brownfields included in the budget for a boost. Then I was out with the county commissioner earlier this week. We were looking at a part of town where they're still on septic system, but they're very close to Tampa Bay, and they have a plan to connect a lot of those homes to water and wastewater over time, but they can only take a little chunk at a time. So it's great to see you proposing more resources for clean water revolving loan. And then, as my colleague Congressman Soto mentioned, we just had a devastating toxic stew from an abandoned phosphogypsum stack pour millions of gallons of very acidic water into Tampa Bay. It's pretty gross, by the way. It's impacting shellfish areas, fishermen. It's probably going to lead to harmful algal bloom. We're suffering through red tide that comes and goes over time, but it also impacts the health of folks. And EPA was here in partnership with folks at the local level and the state, and I want to thank you for that. And then it's the Tampa Bay Estuary Program that's been able to follow up and keep track of the water quality in the bay and make sure that the public understands what's happening. And I know that the Estuary Program is another EPA initiative as well. So all of these, I understand, will receive additional support in the proposed budget. Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
That's fantastic, and that's just in my community. You just replicate that all across America, and it's so very important. Now that with President Biden's election, there is a new emphasis, thankfully, as many of my colleagues have mentioned, on environmental justice. Congressman McEachin and others have asked some questions on that, and we do understand that there are many working class communities and communities of color all across America that have been disproportionately burdened by pollution. In the Select Committee on Climate Crisis, in our action plan that we published last year, we had some recommendations there for stepping up the monitoring of air and water quality, increase enforcement, increase capacity of our environmental justice groups. How will EPA prioritize environmental justice communities for more monitoring and enforcement?
Well, thank you. It's a critical component of how we plan to do business moving forward. Again, I've directed all of my senior leadership to incorporate environmental justice and equity into the DNA of the work that they do in all of the offices at EPA. But as you note, in the 2022 budget and in the American Jobs Plan, there are specific resources called out to focus specifically on environmental justice communities that have been disproportionately impacted, especially through that air quality lens, but also as we look to address water quality issues as well, like lead in pipes and the like. So there's a combination of looking at how we integrate it through policy and regulation through our existing work, and then those additional resources we need for air quality, water affordability as we move forward.
Thank you. And I know we need to also build the capacity of those groups so that they have a meaningful seat at the table when it comes to clean water, clean air, and action on climate. So is that included as well?
There are opportunities for grants and partnership with communities directly, as well as with the states. We know that communities and states know themselves much better than the federal government ever could, and so we are relying heavily on that to get it right.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chairman Tonko.
You're welcome. The gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Arizona, Representative O'Halloran. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Tonko, for holding this important meeting today. I would like to thank the Administrator, Regan, for testifying today. I'm encouraged by what I've seen from the EPA for the first 100 days of this administration. I represent an area in Arizona that is large and rural, spanning more than half the state of Arizona. I guess you can say the easy part is it's larger by 2,000 square miles than the state of Illinois. Rural areas need infrastructure investments. I appreciate your mentioning the need for water infrastructure projects, which is a big concern in Arizona. In your testimony, you also said that under your leadership, the EPA will do everything in its power to clean up and restore lands for our communities. I hope you don't mind that I'm going to hold you to that promise. There are over 250 abandoned uranium mines on Navajo Nation land in Arizona. They are there because the government asked them to allow that mining to go on in the 1940s. For decades, millions of tons of uranium were mined on Navajo lands. These mines have had health impact to local families, including children, including death also. None of the sites could be considered safe, but families live there, children play there, and livestock grazes there. In fact, there's 1,000 homes with partially made out of land, adobe, from those mines. Last year, your predecessor in the EPA added the Navajo abandoned uranium mines to the administrator's Superfund emphasis list. This is a welcome step in the right direction. It's only about 6 decades too late, or 5 decades too late. 2 months ago, the EPA announced $220 million in cleanup funds contracts coming out of a $1.7 billion settlement in 2015. I want to see this cooperation continue at a higher level. Those funds will only address 200 and some mines, maybe, at continuing cost figures. Those funds have been there for a long time and not been used for whatever reason. There needs to be more personnel placed on this project. They need to work closer to the project instead of San Francisco or now Denver is going to open up as an area. I want to see this cooperation continue at a much higher rate. What approach are you going to take when working with communities such as the Navajo Nation, which are hardest hit by environmental hazards? And it has been mentioned, environmental justice is important. Would you please answer that?
Yes, well, thank you for raising that. And I know we'll continue to work very closely with the Navajo Nation on expediting the cleanup of those, as you mentioned, 230 sites. But we recognize that there's about 270 more. And we're going to put a special emphasis on 46 sites, which we have ranked really high. The reality is that with the resources that we're asking for in the 2022 budget and with the American Jobs Plan, there is a focus on how we engage more closely and more strongly with these disadvantaged communities. It only empowers and bolsters EPA's ability to do so if we get those resources. And so my staff is keenly focused on continuing to do the work that we're doing, but also ways that we can strengthen our partnerships with these local communities to be sure that we're putting the resources in the right place.
How's the EPA, under your leadership, going to make these cleanup efforts a priority? We've heard this from past administrations, from past EPA directors. We've heard it time and time and time again, and yet decades go by and nothing gets done. And you don't have to ask for money. It's there in the trust fund right now. So I'm still wondering where we're at and how can your leadership make a change?
I think what we've done is we've prioritized these types of issues, and this is where, through the environmental justice lens, this agency is taking very seriously how we prioritize our response to communities that have been disproportionately impacted for far too long. And so it does require a new emphasis on these communities, which we're engaging on, but it also requires additional resources. This agency has been hit severely over the past 4 years and prior, and so the combination of additional resources and this new focus on environmental justice and equity should yield a stronger result in this area.
Mr. Regan, I appreciate your time here today. I look forward to extended discussions on this issue and other issues of cleanup. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. And that, I believe, concludes the list of colleagues who have chosen to question our witness today. Excuse me. I will take care of some additional business before we move to adjourn. I request unanimous consent to enter the following documents into the record. A 2020 letter from 27 members of Congress to former EPA Administrator Wheeler on the proposed PM 2.5 rule. A 2020 letter from 28 members of Congress to former EPA Administrator Wheeler on the proposed ozone air quality standards rule. An article from Politico entitled Biden's Climate Target Math Still a Mystery. An article from E&E News entitled Whiff of the Unthinkable at EPA, CO2 Standards for States. An article from Inside EPA entitled Environmentalists Bolster Years-Old Petition for EPA to Set CO2 Next. And a client update from Baker Botts entitled EPA's PFAS policy change may delay market entry for innovative chemicals. A 2018 letter from 6 state attorneys general to Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton. A submission of the United States nationally determined contribution in line with Article 4 of the Paris Agreement. A 2021 letter from Patrick Morrissey, Attorney General of West Virginia, to EPA Administrator Regan. So any objection? Hearing none, without objection, so ordered. Again, Administrator Regan, we thank you for participating with us today. You've endured for several hours here, and we thank you for responding to the questions posed your way. I speak for myself for certain, and I believe members across the board on this subcommittee and with the Standing Committee of Energy and Commerce that we look forward to working with you. I wish you success. Your success translates into success for the stewardship of our planet Earth. So we thank you for your leadership. I remind members that pursuant to committee rules, they have 10 business days by which to submit additional questions for the record to be answered by our witness. I ask that you, Administrator Regan, respond promptly, please, to any such questions that you may receive. And at this time, the subcommittee is adjourned.